Fashion archivists. They stay up all night bidding on Japanese auction sites. They're collectors, but they get mad at you when you compare them to a Funko Pop collector because they think they're more like art collectors, even though what they're collecting is Pink Panther t-shirts. But even though they don't wash their clothes, they got a pretty good life. But currently there is a huge problem and threat to their existence. Kids dressed like anime characters.
What's good, everybody? My name is Karsten Craning. We're back at it again with another YouTube video. Today I want to talk about archive fashion. Archive fashion has been one of the most dominant subcultures in fashion for the past couple of years, but trouble is brewing in the tribe of smelly garment wearers as a new generation has sort of come and tried to redefine what archive is. And while a lot of the older generation has sort of maintained this get off my lawn attitude towards the new gen, claiming these newer archive pages aren't really archive enough and are subsequently killing the culture. And while it definitely is hard to see a grown man who occasionally dresses like Ryuk scold a teenage boy for always dressing like Ryuk, there is some truth to this claim. So it does beg the question, is archive dying or is it just evolving? Let's talk about what archive is first and the history of the term archive as it relates to fashion. In general, it's like a library or a collection. And the term has a connotation that the collection is of important preservation or educational purposes. The concept of fashion archives really started to begin in the second half of the 20th century as institutions such as fashion publications, brands, universities would begin to amass massive archives of clothing because they deemed the clothes to be culturally important, just as a museum or a library would also keep an archive. Now, it's important to note that archive as a term when it relates to fashion in the beginning only related to an institution-supported fashion collection. However, at some point, these institutions needed to source more culturally important garments, and so they would turn to private collectors to acquire and source more garments. And as this happened, a lot of these private collectors realized that their own collection was bigger than the institution's archive. And so they realized they could kind of start calling their own collections archives. And it was a nice rebrand for them. The private collectors kind of went from being obsessive hoarders of old stinky clothes to instead being an archivist of garments which were of the utmost artistic importance and were coveted by the highest cultural institutions. However, archive really wouldn't become a buzzword until 2010, and that's when the culture would really form around the concept of archiving. The story of how archive became a culture starts with Raf Simons. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Raf Simons was creating some of his first collections. Think of Riot, 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 Virginia Creeper, Closer, Consumed. And while today we know these as some of the most iconic fashion collections from that era, at the time they were considered commercial flops. While these collections were well regarded in the fashion community, nobody really wanted to buy the clothes. Raf, at the end of the day, was just too ahead of his time. And while many of his early collections were commercial failures, he still had a small but dedicated fan base at the time. One of these early Raf Simons fans was a young boy named David Cassavant. David lived in rural Tennessee at the time, and he was raised by his single father. And while his father definitely had enough to support them both, he was often away at business, meaning he would leave a young 13-year-old David alone at home. However, he would leave David with money. I either have to assume that David's father was either somewhat well off or that he just didn't know how much food cost, because David would take the money and just sit on eBay all day and go, ooh, yeah, this is a cool jacket. Let's fucking go! David at 14 was collecting a considerable amount of Raf Simons. Now again, back at this time, it was pretty cheap. A jacket that now goes for thousands of dollars was going for like $100 at the time. And by the time David had grown up to be an adult, he ended up having a massive Raf Simons collection. The sort of cultural relevance of Raf had also grown. Raf had ended up, after his early collections, being the creative director of both Jill Sander and Dior, and more people were beginning to look back and see his solo collections and look at them more fondly. And all of a sudden, all those Raf Simons jackets that David had bought for a couple of $100s were now worth the price of a modest luxury car. David's collection, or archive as he called it, started to get a lot of media attention, as he became famous for renting out his massive archive to the likes of Kanye West, Travis Scott, Rihanna, an internet subculture and community made up of cult menswear fashion enthusiasts really began and started to take form, searching for older pieces that they had always coveted. The internet turned them into treasure hunters in a way. Out of this culture is how Grailed was actually formed, and their name actually is an in-joke for the community, because the community always compared themselves of hunting down those fashion pieces that they liked, almost like archaeologists or treasure hunters. And the name Grailed comes from the Holy Grail in Indiana Jones, who's an archaeologist who hunts treasure. Brought us into what I like to call the golden age of archive. The concept of having an archive kind of became mythologized with these menswear fans in a way. And naturally, it seemed pretty cool. You have a massive amount of cool clothing that's worth a down payment on a house. You loan those clothes out to your favorite celebrity. And also, you're a morally pious cultural hero for preserving important garments and art and showing them off for free on your Instagram. Also, like a general pantheon at this time of what could be considered archive pieces. Generally speaking, most of archive was sort of avant-garde, darker menswear from the 80s to the early 2000s. And archive at the time was so specific down to particular seasons. So for example, Undercover by Jun Takahashi, Scab 2003, that collection, considered archive. Streetwear t-shirts that were sold in Nowhere around the same time aren't considered archive. But generally, the archive community was a fun place. While yes, a lot of the clothes in the golden age were reselling for very expensive prices, in this era, if you knew a lot, did your research, knew the right people, you could find a lot of these archive grailed pieces for reasonable prices at the time, just if you knew where to look. And also, you really just generally didn't have to be spending a lot of money in general to be having fun and be part of the community. A lot of the information on these cult menswear designers really hadn't been digitized or uploaded to the internet, and communities online scoured for information on a lot of these older collections. A lot of people took pride in digitizing the information on the archive pantheon, and that's actually how this channel started. I was a kid who loved researching archive. Starting off in that community, I was a teenager who didn't have a lot of excess money. And because I cared and I helped people, it led to a lot of the older archive guys helping me find some pretty good pieces for some steals, or selling me some of their pieces for a good deal that I could afford as a teenager. Because the community really cared for each other, it felt like. In the golden age, it really felt like a group of archaeologists and treasure hunters who were scouring the information, researching, while others found cool objects and actual clothes. Others dug deep to find out about the history. Like, I was literally doing quests. Like, one time I scoured to find this old Raf Simons book that had all these pictures that hadn't been uploaded to the internet. And I found it and I digitized it and I sent it to like other members of the community and my friends. And because of that, a guy was really thankful. And he gave me like a crazy deal on a Rick coat. And it was cool. It felt like I went on a quest and I like got this book and gave it to someone, and in return, I got a jacket to my inventory. However, there is only so much buried treasure in the world. As archive got bigger over the years, it also got more hyped. And this is how the DeVille Issey Sport incident happened. To preface this, DeVille is a nice guy. If you don't know who DeVille is, DeVille was a Grailed employee who was also an influencer, archive seller, and just was generally known for his collection of Japanese brands like Comme. Now at some point, DeVille came across an Issey Miyake subline called Issey Miyake Sport. Now what Issey Sport is that Issey Miyake in the 80s noticed that branded sportswear was becoming popular. Brands like Polo and Nike were racking big money on these cheaply produced sportswear items that were just like heavily branded. And Issey wanted a piece of that money. However, the problem was that Issey Miyake at the time was known for their avant-garde, high quality, technical designs. And the Issey Sports subline was mediocre quality, not very technical, and the only thing that made it like clearly Issey Miyake was the gigantic logo plastered on it. Issey Miyake could not sell Issey Sport for the life of them. It flopped so hard that no one in Japan would buy it. So what they ended up having to do it was ship containers upon containers of it to developing countries at the time like Vietnam and Thailand, where they would either sell it for pennies or they would give it away for free. Now, DeVille ended up finding some Issey Sport pieces on a trip to Vietnam for what I could only assume would be like very little money. Then, when he came back to the States with all these bombers, he started sort of using his influencing power to generate hype around them. And these bombers, which at one point sold for pennies, were starting to sell for $800 a piece. Many of the more savvy members of the archive community saw this and realized how easy it was to inflate hype and therefore inflate the prices of archive items. And eventually there were pages like Archive, which would buy a whole other archive pages like stock at top market value, which was already sort of a shaky price. And then they would resell all those pieces on their own page and mark them up for tens of thousands of dollars. And this is kind of like what brought on the end of the golden age of archive. It's also when the term archive hypebeast came into play. On top of that, a lot of the places where you could traditionally get archive for cheaper, like Yahoo Japan, were continuously becoming more and more picked over, and it was harder and harder to find pieces for more affordable prices. Because of all the inflation, the hype, and all these new archive pages that were popping up, a lot of the old community was sort of boxed out by the new inflated pricing. And if you wanted to be into archive, you had to have a much bigger disposable income. But beginning in 2023 and now in 2024, we're starting to see like a new era of archive pages that have popped up, and they're actually selling pieces for a reasonable price. However, the reason that this is happening is because the brands are different. These new archive pages aren't selling the same brands as old archive pages. Remember, the original archive had a very specific pantheon of designers, and they were very specific about what could be considered archive. And while a lot of these brands are from the same era and very much of the same style, they aren't from that original pantheon. So a lot of OG archivists are calling out the new generation of archive pages because they think they're sort of ruining archive. Because the brands that the new gen of archive pages are selling and are interested in aren't as highly regarded from a cultural standpoint. The first brand that really caught on with like the new gen archivists is Rick Owens Slab. But Rick Owens Slab was a denim line that Rick had in like the early 2000s. And much like Issey Sport, it failed commercially. I remember I had friends who had gone to these warehouses that were full of Rick Owens Slab denim, and they were just like buying pairs for like $10. You could easily find pairs on eBay for like under $100. But this new gen of archivists ended up really liking Rick Owens Slab. Back in the day, brands like Le Grand Bleu and ifsixwasnine were sort of considered like the poor man's Undercover or Number 9. GOA retailed for like extremely low prices. Even brands like Backlash or YASUYUKI Ishii, while their designs and materials were generally good and on par with like a Guidi or Boris, they never really were as culturally relevant or as popular. And so yes, the original generation of archivists are right. The new gen pantheon of archive and the designers they're interested are not as culturally significant or esteemed or as original. Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Archive was pretty much made inaccessible to younger generations when it got so hyped. So in response, the younger generation redefined what archive was. And look, they're hunting for their favorite pieces online, getting good deals, researching, learning more information about the designers. They're working hard, having fun, curating their own styles, building a community, and yeah, making some money off of it too. But at the end of the day, the new gen archive pages don't have insanely exploitative markups that plague the original community. So yeah, I get it. It's easy to hate on like the new younger generation of archivists and dismiss it as corny because you don't want that mellow from Death Note swag. But at the end of the day, kids are having fun, building a community when they've been price locked out of another one. And look, the time I spent in the archive community in the early days was really awesome and formative for me as a young adult, and helped me grow. And I would like the younger generation to have a similar authentic experience to that in a way. Thank you for watching this video. My name is Karsten Craning. Please like, subscribe, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.